Colm, tell the audience all about Colm O'Brien.
I will, John. Thank you for that. So I'm from Dublin originally. I'm living here in Killaloe in County Clare, beautiful part of the world. And I went to school on the north side. I'm from the north side of Dublin. Went to school, secondary school at St. Paul's College in Raheny there. And when I was leaving school back, feels like 173 years ago, when I was leaving school, I thought I wanted to be a school teacher, right? But the universe had different plans. And so I didn't manage to get into teacher training college. And I only wanted to be a teacher because of the short hours and the long holidays, to be honest. It wasn't about educating the next generation or saving the world, right? With short hours, or my perception that teachers had short hours and long holidays. And but anyway, the universe, I always say the man upstairs had a different plan, threw me into hospitality, which is the exact opposite of that. Long hours and short holidays, right? But it was a great training ground. And that, you know, I started my career. Some of your viewers will know Cleary's department store, originally on O'Connell Street in Dublin. I started my career there in the rooftop restaurant, moved to the ILAC Centre, joined Bewley's Cafes again. Your viewers may know Bewley's Cafes, and was general manager indeed of Bewley's Cafe in Grafton Street in the early 1990s for about 4 years. Thereafter, I was franchise manager for the Bewley's Cafe brand, which took me outside the pale. And being a Dub, I used to think that the world revolved around the M50, right? There was Dublin, and then beyond the pale, if you like, there was the country. But we moved to Limerick in 1998 and took on a Bewley's Cafe franchise. And that was a huge change for us, huge different way of life. It's been very good to us here in the Midwest, but that business failed. Right. So I'll hand it back to you for a moment, John. You decide where we're going to go next.
Can you explain for the audience how you progressed from working in the restaurant in Cleary's in O'Connell Street, Dublin, to becoming the general manager of Bewley's Cafe in Grafton Street?
Really good question. As I say, I stumbled into hospitality. And there was no real plan, to be honest. I was just working hard. I was a young fella, 17, I think, when I started. Had my few bob at the end of the week. I used to smoke at the time, so I was able to afford a few cigarettes and a few beers. And life was great. But after a few years, and then I grew up and I met Aidy, my wife, and we had our first daughter, Shona, and all of a sudden life began to get serious. And I thought I better, do something with my life and my career. So I started applying for jobs and ended up getting an offer of 2 jobs, as it happens, on the same day. One was in Bewley's in Grafton Street as a senior manager, but not the general manager. And the other was as the general manager of a small cafe in Black Rock. Can't remember the name of it now. And the small cafe in Black Rock had a bigger title and a bigger salary. But I chose the other one specifically because I knew there was better opportunity to learn and grow. And that's probably been a feature of how I've operated ever since. So took a bit of a financial hit, but got into an organization that I knew I could learn from and grow within. And that was 1988. By 1991, I was running that particular cafe. And of course, that's a very famous institution in Ireland. So glad to have done it.
And what did you learn about yourself as a person when you stepped up to the plate and became the general manager of the famous Bewley's Cafe in Grafton Street?
Very perceptive question there, John. I'll tell you what I learned was two things. I was when I joined Bewley's that first day in that sort of one tier down role, I was very nervous. I literally couldn't swallow for, I think, weeks. That's my memory of it, right? Because I was so nervous that I didn't know that what I had learned for the previous 8 years since I'd started my catering career, I didn't know that it was translatable, that it would work in this new environment. And of course, Bewley's was this. It was the what's the word I'm looking for? It was the benchmark, if you like. Everybody knew Bewley's, and so I didn't. So once I got over that, and I became general manager, I was only 28 when I became general manager, so I was very young. But I felt the time was right. I felt that I'd spent 3 years, if you like, in the machine that is Bewley's, learning about the brand and all the rest of it. And I realized that I was ready for it, and the company was obviously believed I was, so they promoted me. But I also learned something, John, that, and I'm going to explain this. I think I'm going to need to, but you can never become general manager of Bewley's in Grafton Street until you become the general manager of Bewley's in Grafton Street. So we must grow ourselves personally, professionally, so that the opportunities are afforded to us. But once we step into the role, it's our first time in the role. So we've got to take it from there and grow. But I felt confident enough in my own abilities at that stage, my own understanding of the brand, that I felt I could make a difference, and had a wonderful 4 years.
Thank you. What motivated you to move from a secure job of being general manager of Bewley's to setting up your own franchise?
I didn't know this at the time, John, but I met a guy recently, an older gentleman in his 70s at this stage, thorough gentleman. And when I met him first, I was asking him about his career, and he said, "I've made millions in my career." I said, "Really?" He said, "Yeah, for other people," right? Because he spent all of his life working in senior roles in big companies, okay? And he called it the fur-lined mousetrap, right? And I said, "You better explain the fur-lined mousetrap to me." So he said, fur-lined mousetrap is that it is the corporate job. It's got a nice title. Sometimes it's a company car. Often has, you've got a regular salary. Often might have a bonus thing thrown in, etc. And it's comfortable and it's warm and it's fuzzy and it's furry, right? The fur-lined mousetrap. But it is a trap, right? For anybody who's ambitious. And it's a very difficult thing to get out of, right? It's a very difficult thing to be brave enough to step out of. So what I did to prepare myself for getting out was I began to study the principles of business ownership rather than working for somebody. And I came across a book which I'll happily recommend to you and to your viewers, and that is The Cash Flow Quadrant by Robert Kiyosaki. The Cash Flow Quadrant by Robert Kiyosaki, the second in his series of Rich Dad, Poor Dad books. And in it, Kiyosaki talks about the 4 players in the world of commerce: the employee, the self-employed, the business owner, and the investor. Right? And those 4 players, animals, if you like, are all different animals, right? And they all require different skill sets and to look at the world in a different way. I was an employee, clearly, at the time. But I also realized that I actually didn't want to be self-employed. I didn't want to trade one job where I was trading my time for money for being self-employed, where I also felt I'd be trading my time for money. I wanted, and I didn't have any money, so I couldn't be an investor. So that left me with the only quadrant, if you like, left was the business ownership quadrant. So I decided I needed to learn the skills of finding out how to build a business rather than being self-employed. And that put me on the path. I became open to it. I began to read stuff. I began to listen to leaders. I began to look around the people I knew. How is that person getting ahead and that person is not? And I just began to understand the different dynamics. And then the opportunity presented itself down in Limerick to take on the Bewley's Café franchise in Cruiser Street. And what I liked about that particular one was it was big enough, John, for it to be a business and for me not to be self-employed. It was going to be me and a team, if that makes sense, yeah? As my dad used to say to me, my dad's a great guy, he's 82, Tommy, and he would often say to me, he said, "Oh, Carl," he said, "you're very good at what you do." He says, you'd make a fortune in your own little coffee shop. And I remember saying to him, "Dad, I don't know why, but I think I'd kill myself if I had my own little coffee shop." But I didn't understand why I was so strong on that sentiment until I read Kiyosaki and realized I just didn't want to be self-employed. The little coffee shop analogy was, me throwing the shutter up, me taking your order, me making your coffee, me dropping your breakfast down to you, me taking the money from you, me cleaning up after you. Right? I didn't want that. But put me in a team where there's 20, 30, 40, 50 people doing all that. And now I'm in my element. And that's what gave me the confidence, if you like, to step out.
Yeah. So what motivated you to move from cosmopolitan Dublin to a more provincial city like Limerick? Was it a change of scenery for you, or what was the motivation behind that?
No, again, another great question. Regrettably, Limerick has had a very bad reputation historically. And it came up very recently, as it happens. There was a huge furore. I'm sure you're aware of what I'm talking about there. I won't get into it. But so people were raising eyebrows all over the place. You're going where? But the only reason we went to Limerick at the time was for opportunity. That was it. The opportunity presented itself. The right opportunity presented itself at the right time in our lives, or perhaps in my life. And the family got behind me, and we moved to Limerick. And we didn't know anybody. We didn't know where to live. We rented a house in Duradoyle. We, just got stuck into the business. I think we rented for a year, then we bought a house. So it took our time, but the only reason we moved was for opportunity. It wasn't for, and now that said, in that year, which was 1998, that was the year I turned 35. And on my 35th birthday, I found myself wearing my Bewley's franchise manager's hat. I found myself in Tralee on my birthday. It was a Monday. And I was down there because a couple wanted a Bewley's Café franchise in Tralee. And I was dispatched to go down and find out what their opportunity. My role at the time, John, was to look at a location, a person, and the Bewley's brand, and see could I connect those three, and did it make sense? And but I'll tell you what I found that day. Apart from making new friends, I found there was lifestyle outside the big smoke. Right, there was lifestyle, genuine lifestyle. There was a slower pace of life. And at the time, I was commuting we were living in Selbridge at the time, so I was commuting, perhaps an hour each way into the city centre to my job and back. You know what I mean? So I saw that could change. So once we moved to Limerick, my commute time was 10 minutes each way. So I saw opportunity before I even considered Limerick's unfortunate and wrong reputation. But we're still here in the Midwest ever since. Love it.
I know that franchise did not work out for you financially in Limerick. How did that impact your motivation and self-esteem as a person when you incurred a lot of financial losses?
It hurt, as you can imagine. It hurt my ego. I was the guy who had only a few years earlier run the flagship store for the brand, right? And here was I in a struggling cafe. But I managed to take a step back from what was going on to find out what was really going on. And there was what I refer to in my book, Feeding Johnny. I refer to it as the perfect storm, John. And so what happened was, it was around the turn of the century. We took over in 1998 and business actually began to grow. And why did it begin to grow? A whole series of things. The market was good. The environment was good. There was a few bob around. But I was also a good interpreter of the Bewley's brand because of my experience. So I was able to offer a very credible experience, very credible Bewley's Dublin experience in Limerick. So people flocked in the door. Business was great. And then around the turn of the century, just after 2001, into 2001, there was a shift. There was a change in customer eating habits. The punters wanted, wraps and paninis and lattes and cappuccinos. And that was stuff that Bewley's wasn't famous for. You might recall Bewley's back in the day. Wonderful bacon, egg and sausage, like the best breakfast in the world, right? But there were only two coffees in Ireland at the time, black or white, and Bewley's were masters at both, right? And all of a sudden this new fancy stuff came in, and the marketplace started to vote with its feet and go elsewhere. So our business began a very slow decline. It wasn't quite as strong one year after the next. It wasn't terribly worrying, but and Bewley's as a brand tried to shift, and cappuccinos came in and all this type of stuff, but it was sort of too little too late. So there was a bit of people leaving the brand and going elsewhere, not just our cafe. And the second thing that happened was foot and mouth disease. Don't know if you recall foot and mouth disease.
Yes.
Yeah, so that hit, right? And the effect that had particularly you mentioned we moved to provincial Ireland, particularly in the provinces, was Limerick City is surrounded by beautiful farmland, right? So the hinterland was in lockdown. Believe it or not, here we are back in lockdown, right? And the hinterland was in lockdown, and the people were told, don't go into the cities, you'll spread this disease. So they all stayed at home. So our business that had been growing steadily and then begun a slow decline because of customer changing eating habits, then dropped literally 20% overnight. Big problem, right? And that went on for about 6 months, just about coming out of that. And 9/11 struck, John, right, in New York. And again, you might be asking, how couldn't something in New York impact Limerick City in the Midwest of Ireland? Well, the answer to that is simply Shannon Airport. The Americans never flew back, right? We were expecting there was huge influx of American tourists into Limerick, into the Midwest all the time. That stopped with foot and mouth disease, and then 9/11 that turned that tap off completely. So any bounce we were hoping to get back didn't happen. So our business stayed flat for an extended period. And then on top of that, and the final nail that put us out of business effectively was what I refer to in the book, if you don't mind me saying, as the Celtic Tiger, right? That's the title of it in my book. You can edit that piece out, Remy, if you wish, right? The Celtic Tiger, what the final nail in our coffin was the Celtic Tiger, because the Celtic Tiger was this madness, as you'll remember, that grips the country, that told us that our properties were worth more today than they were yesterday, and more again tomorrow, and more again the next day, and more again the next day. And the effect that had on properties, commercial and otherwise, was that valuations went up on paper, not in reality. And landlords felt within their power to, come in and seek rent hikes. And it happened at a time when our 5-year upward only rent review clause was taking place. And our rent went up in our Café. Will you hear this? A coffee shop on a pedestrian street in Limerick, which is Ireland's third city. Our rent went up to €1,000 per day, right? €1,000 per day, right? To sell cups of coffee that people didn't even want anymore. They didn't want black and white coffee anymore, and rasher sandwiches that people didn't want anymore. They wanted, so we were in big trouble, and that's how it began to unravel. So that's a long-winded answer to the question: did that have an impact? Of course it did, but it wasn't only my fault. That's the point, right? And so I remember years later realizing and saying, verbalizing, that our business failed, John. We didn't fail. Our business failed. We didn't fail. I think that's a really important distinction. It took us a while to get our heads around that. We did our very best we could given the circumstances, but it wasn't enough. And it was never going to be enough, as it happens. That rent review at the very end was the final nail. You can't sell. In fact, Bewley's in Grafton Street, right, my old alma mater, literally shut down 1 month before we did, right? Talk about feeling lucky, because we were able to say, it's not just us, lads. Look, flagship has gone. The flagship has bounced back, obviously, over the years, but we didn't.
So what you're saying there effectively is changing consumer tastes and other external forces, such as the 9/11 bombings in New York and a rent review that was upward only, all impacted the business, and it wasn't a sustainable business model going forward. You then had a chance meeting with another man, and you set up this business called Carambola. Tell us all about that.
I will, yeah. Thank you. Thanks for knowing that. You've done your research, John. Your research team is doing a great job, by the way. But look, I think the pivotal moment for me, and thank you for allowing me to bring everybody up through the journey there. So at this moment in time, it's 2003. The Café is failing. I used to think, by the way, a business would fail, if you like, overnight. But I've realized now that it's like a slow train crash. You can see it happening. And, at a point, there's nothing you can do to stop it. It's inevitable. So we saw the train crash happening, okay? And so in an effort to try and salvage the situation, I took a number of steps. Number one, with their permission, gracious permission, I handed Bewley's back their brand, right? And rebranded from Bewley's to Cruises Coffee Company, because we were on Cruises Street in Limerick. And the effect that had, they were very gracious to allow us to do that, but that saved us 50 grand a year in franchise fees, right? Which, by the way, was excellent value for money when things were going well. Because to be aligned with the quality brand like Bewley's, you'd pay that type of money easily. But we needed to pay the rent. But here's the problem, John. At £1,000 a day per rent, all that did was give us an extra 50 days in the year rent. Just kept us alive 50 more days, right? It was never going to be enough. So I took the Cruises Coffee brand and decided I wanted to franchise it based on my background. Thought we'll follow the Insomnias or whoever it was in the day, the Café Cells in the day. I can't remember who was there. We'd replicate what they're doing. And you might know, and some of your viewers will know this. Do you know the kiosks on the Liffey Boardwalk there in Dublin?
I do indeed, yes, yeah.
So there are some kiosks there selling coffee, and we took those on, okay? We were fortunate enough to be granted a license to run those, myself, my brother, and a friend at the time. And we took the Cruises Coffee Company brand to Dublin, sort of, if you like, exported it from Limerick to Dublin. And that looked like there was light at the end of the tunnel, and I was up and down regularly on the train to see could I, to help that business develop and all the rest of it. And it was quite an exciting time. This was late 2003. And yes, so I'm on the train one day. This is where the story changes for the better. And I met this man on the train. And you know the way trains were, of course, pre-COVID, when we could all sit beside each other, right? But trains were, I was sitting on the outside. There was a guy sitting on my inside at the window. We were all facing forward. I'm not sure how this is coming out camera-wise for you, but we were all facing forward on our way to Dublin. And we nodded at each other, and the two of us got on with whatever we were doing. And towards the end of the journey, sort of passing Kildare, it was time to have a conversation. We both seemed to have finished our work, whatever we were doing. So we started chatting. And we swapped business cards, as you do. That was the thing back in the day. I don't think the next generation do that, but I think they tap phones together or something. That's how they swap details, right? But back in the day, business cards were all the rage. So we swapped business cards, and he looked at my business card, which was a Cruises Coffee Company card, and he says, Colm O'Brien, phone number. I think there was an email address. He said, Cruises Coffee Company. And there was a strap line under my name. It says, how can I help? And he said to me, what does that mean? And I said, oh, that's my offer to the universe. If I can be of any help in any way, feel free to pick up the phone. If I can help you, I will. If I can't, or I might find somebody who can. And he said, that's very interesting. And he pocketed my business card, and he never rang me. Of course, I never even thought about it. That was just one of many interactions, right? But 3 months later, John, his boss rang me. So what had happened was, your man had gone to Dublin, as I had, on business. He went back to Limerick that evening and met his boss, who worked for a company, not a company, a social impact organization, social inclusion organization called Paul Partnership in Limerick, right? Back to his boss, and he said, come here, I met this guy on the train. And he says, he's in the food game. If you're ever doing anything with food, give your man a shout. He was referring to me. He says, your man's an interesting character. So by the time the boss rang me, this is really interesting, I think. By the time the boss rang me 3 months later, my man had left the organization. He'd just been there for a short time, met me, took my card, gave it to his boss, and left, right? And the boss then rings me 3 months later and says, have your card, see you're in the food game. Paul Partnership is running a pilot program for school lunches, healthy school lunches here in Limerick. Are you interested in tendering? I said, yes, I am. Thank you very much indeed. We tendered, John. We won the tender. Turns out we only heard 2 years later, nobody has tendered. Nobody has bothered, right? We supplied 27 children on our first day in Corpus Christi School in Moyross, which is a very disadvantaged area of Limerick City. And we supplied 27 children our first day. And that was almost 18 years ago now. And since then, because of the man on the train, right, because of that moment, our business has grown. We got it to a peak of 10 million in revenue in 2018. It looks like we'll get back to that in the school year 21-22. And we employ 120 people nationwide, and that all came from meeting the man on the train. And delighted to be able to relate that story.
That's a great story, and thank you for sharing it, because you never know how a chance conversation on public transport, whether it's a train or a plane, bus, where it can lead. And for you, in that case, it opened many new doors and led to great success. So well done to you. What was your motivation behind writing and publishing the book, Feeding Johnny?
Right. So yeah, and thank you for pointing that out. I'm a huge fan of networking, John. Like everything happens, in my opinion, through networking, but it can't be forced. So if I may just offer, before I talk to you about Feeding Johnny, if I may just offer two pieces of advice, remind myself of them and offer them out to people out there in your audience. One is there are two criteria that must apply, in my opinion and in my experience, for you to meet your man on the train moment. By the way, I believe there's a man on the train moment out there for all of us. The universe has them out there with our names on them, loads of them, if we're just open to seeing, right? So for you to encounter your man on the train moment, there are two criteria that must apply, in my opinion. Number one, you must be out there doing your thing. Now, here we are in COVID, we're in lockdown. We can't be out there, except we can be on here. And John, thank you for inviting me on here, and congratulations on setting up the GYFT Show. That's you being out there and assisting other people like me to be out there in this new reality. So we must be out there. Otherwise, nobody would see us, right? There was no way the guy on the train, right, was ever going to knock on my door in Dooradale and say, I've got this great idea that'll change your life. Not possible, right? It was because I was out there doing my thing. That's the first thing. So you must be out there doing your thing. That's the first criterion. The second criterion that must apply, in my opinion, stop selling, start serving. Stop selling, start serving. Think about it. My business was dying, right? I was trying to resurrect it. I gave him my business card, and there was a strap line with no strings attached. How can I help? And this isn't me saying I'm great, right? I'm just sharing it in my experience. And by the way, anybody put how can I help on your business card? There's no franchise fee attached, right? Put it on and see where doors it opens. I was out there handing my business card, no strings attached. It was that strap line and the no strings attached association that empowered him to give it to his boss. If I'd come to him and said, "Come here, buddy, help a fella out. Would you start buying sandwiches or coffee for your office? Because I'm hurting here." I wouldn't be having this conversation with you today. So must be out there doing our thing with integrity, and we must be out there to serve first. Stop selling, start serving. Okay, feeding Johnny, right? Roll on all those years, right? And I was turning 50, showing my age here now. I'm 58, turned 58 there last month. So I was turning 50 in 2013. And a friend of mine came to me and said, listen, his partner, his life partner was running a book writing course in Limerick City sometime in January of 2013, and I was turning 50 in March. And he said, you need to go to that. And he says, you learn how to write a book. I said, great. And I thought to myself, I'd always fancied myself a writer. So I said, I will. I'll treat myself for my 50th. And I paid the few bob and went along to a day's training on how to write a book. And 7 months later, I had the manuscript that became Feeding Johnny. I'll show it to you here if I may. So that's the book, Feeding Johnny, How to Build a Business Despite the Roadblocks. And that came from that half-day course or full-day course. And that's changed my life again, right? Unintentional. I did it as a bucket list thing for me. The interesting thing, John, if I may, because there's always, in all of our journeys, it's always tiny little moments that make the difference, right? And we can only connect the dots backwards. I find that intriguing. We can only really connect the dots backwards, right? But so in that program, Donna Kennedy, I'll give her a plug there. Donna Kennedy said to me, she was the lady teaching us the principles behind writing the book. She said, Colm, she says, your book will set you up as an expert in something. Said this to the room. So she says, you've got to decide what you want to be seen as an expert in. And she said, for you, Colm, it's likely to be nutrition for kids, because she knew of Carambola. And I said, well, I know nothing about nutrition for kids. We hire people in Carambola who know that stuff. But I'll tell you what I do know. I know the bitter taste of the failure of my first business and the struggle that was required to climb out of that, and therefore the founding of Carambola. So I write about that. So the book became a business book, but it wasn't planned, right? But here's what happened then, John. The book went out into circulation. We had a bit of a knees up in O'Mahony's bookstore in Limerick. We had a couple of hundred people arrived on a night, and we had a few glasses of wine and a bit of crack. And but people began to read the book, which was a nice bonus, right? But then people began to make contact with me and say, come here, I'm reading your book, and do you see what you went through in chapter 4 or 7 or whatever? I'm going through that in my business. Would you walk me through it? And I became a bit of a reluctant business coach. So that's where the book came from, and it's led to this whole new journey for me. And you know, it's opening up all sorts of opportunities. No more than your own journey at this stage, John. Different opportunities have presented. And here's the thing, if I may, you've been brave enough to take the ball on the hop, and if you like, open the door of those opportunities that present themselves. And I've done the same. And if there's one mistake I think people make, is they perhaps keep banging on doors that just aren't opening, right? And out of the corner of their eye, they can see a door that is actually ajar. In my opinion and in my experience, stop banging on that door that's not opening for you, and just peep through the door that's ajar and see where that leads you. Think about it, if I may. I'll go back to the coffee shops on the boardwalk. I stepped away from that business. Carambola, the school meals business, began to grow almost despite myself. I thought we could trade our way out of the difficulties in Limerick. We weren't able to, right? In those early years, the rent was still too high. But what I realized was I was trying to beat my head down the coffee shop franchise route, and it wasn't opening. The doors weren't opening. And then over here, this school lunch thing began to open. Right? One school after another came on board. I said, I better start seeing what's going on here. And here we are today with Carambola, multi-million euro business with 120 employees.
And what about Feeding Johnny?
Sorry, Feeding Johnny, the book is the story. That's all it is. It's the story of those early years. It's the potted history of me growing up on Dublin's north side. I wanted to be a teacher. It's all the stuff I told you earlier. But then as it gets into it, it touches on the lessons that I took from each chapter in my journey. And chapter 8 in the book, it's an 8-chapter book, 160 pages. And in chapter 8, I list out 10 lessons that I took from that journey and how I applied them into the next chapter, dare I say it, of my career. Of course, the book is now 8 years. I'm now in the middle of writing a second book, long time overdue, but the universal timing is always right, John. And this book will be the right book for where I am now and where I'm headed next. For me to have written another book in the interim would have me just been saying more of the same, but my career has moved on. Since Carambola, I've stepped to one side in the last year. I'm now chairman. My wife has stepped up as managing director. So I'm now out of the day-to-day operations, and I'm developing that coaching business that came from the book, where I was one-on-one coaching. I didn't particularly enjoy it, to be honest. I'm much better in group situations. So I've now created a business called WigWam. And it's a global mastermind business that I'm developing as a global franchise. And that's really interesting. That's where Feeding Johnny has led to.
Great answer. And tell me, where do you see WigWam going over the next 4 or 5 years as a business?
Okay, I've given this a lot of thought. So 2016, the book was published, written 2015, excuse me, it was published. 2016 was when I started coaching people, but I was a bit of a reluctant coach. Remember what I said earlier, John, about Robert Kiyosaki and the cash flow quadrant? I found myself as a coach being self-employed. It was me trading my time in front of a client to earn my few bob, right? And I didn't particularly enjoy that aspect of it. So I decided in 2019 that I wanted to grow a business around coaching. I didn't want to be the coach per se in the room. So I decided I would do group coaching. At least that would give me a higher return for my hour expended if I was working with 6 people rather than 1. But from that, and again, man on the train moment, right? I ran an event here directly across, I'm living in Killaloe, directly across the lake here is the Lakeside Hotel in Ballina, County Tip. And I ran an event there in the middle of the summer 2019, where I told maybe 50 people in the room. I ran a day's program, and I told them I was only going to do group work thereafter. Fell in the room, and I got together, and we decided to collaborate, and we started the journey that had become WigWam. And then, as it happens, he decided for his own reasons to step off the WigWam train and go back to doing it on his own. He'd been doing it on his own for 30 years, so I understood that entirely. And I was probably a bit of a pain to him because I was all about systems and, he's a great guy, brilliant at what he does, but I was trying to systemize what he does so that we could franchise it, because I decided I wanted to build a coaching franchise business. And so he stepped away. Somebody else stepped up into the breach. Her name is Michelle Barry. She was one of our first WigWammers. She was in our first program. And she and I are now developing WigWam as a global franchise. So we're now talking to people in Scotland, people in California, people in Australia at the moment, to take the brand and bring it to those jurisdictions. And we can do so much more easily and less expensively because of, dare I say it, COVID, because Zoom, COVID, I should say, has taught everybody that the medium that you and I are using for this conversation is a perfectly legitimate way of doing business now. So I, for one, have no interest in giving up half a day. You're in Kilcock, if I'm not mistaken.
Correct. Yes. Yeah.
And I'm in Killaloe. So in the other world, right, you and I, one of us would have had to drive 2 hours to get to the other, right? So this conversation that might take an hour would have taken one of us 5, 2 hours up, an hour's chat and 2 hours back, right? I don't want to go back to that, So I see a hybrid model for sure. So that's where WigWam is going. And we've brought about 100 people through WigWam programs in the last year, John. It started about 18 months ago. In the last year, we got serious about it, brought about 100 people through WigWam programs. And we'll bring another 100 people through in the next 9 months. And I've made a decision, set a goal. I want to bring 1 million people through WigWam programs by 2030. That'll be the anniversary of WigWam, 10th anniversary. So 1 million people in the decade between 2020 and 2030. And we can only do that, John, if we invite other people to participate and offer WigWam out in their jurisdictions. So that's thus the franchise model.
Yeah. How can people get in contact with you? And how can people get a signed copy of your book, Feeding Johnny?
Well, the first one is easy, right? I think if people simply Google Colm O'Brien motivation, that's probably the easiest way. We're on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, you know, all those, Twitter, YouTube, big YouTube channel there. But so Google Colm O'Brien motivation or go into any of those platforms and COB motivation in some of those platforms. But basically Colm O'Brien motivation, you should find us. Getting a signed copy of the book now, there's a more difficult one, right? Because that book is now out of print. Very few copies left. I do think Amazon has a few, but I'd like to offer, if I may, John, with your permission, I'd like to offer one person a signed copy that I will send to them with my compliments if they make contact. And I think they need to do something to get the signed copy. Firstly, they need to be, it's the first person who's going to come in to make contact with me somehow, having viewed the show here, the GYFT Show, right? Reference the GYFT Show, GYFT, it's very important. They reference GYFT, and they answer this simple question. And they can find the answer to this question if they listen to the recording, right, of the program that you and I've just recorded. And that is, what are the 2 criteria that must apply for you to meet your man in the train moment and make it happen? What are the 2 criteria that must apply? So the first person who references the GYFT Show and answers that question correctly and gives me their details, their postal address, I will post them a copy of Feeding Johnny with my compliments signed.
Thank you for all these great answers today, Colm. And I think in summary, your business success over the years has been down to your networking skills and your ability to get people working around you and to identify ideas that you can take forward and develop. You're a very entrepreneurial individual, and I wish you very well for the future.
John, you're very kind. You're very kind. It's been lovely to be here on the GYFT Show, and congratulations you too on we'll use that shocking COVID word, pivoting, right? On looking for new ways of getting your message out there. So I wish you and all in the GYFT Show the very best. So thank you for having me here.
You're very welcome. And I think for our audience today, if you're made redundant due to COVID-19, it might be the end of one chapter in your life, but redundancy can be the opening of a much better and brighter chapter in your life. And if you follow what Colm has been saying today, don't let failure get to your heart. There's always a brighter future out there.
And John, if I may just add to that, because you've been speaking specifically there to people who may have been made redundant. Firstly, feel your pain if that's where you're at, and acknowledge it. Secondly, go back to what I said earlier in the conversation with John here about the fur-lined mousetrap. Maybe that's the universe's way of saying, right, you're out of the fur-lined mousetrap now, go bet on yourself. And that's what I'd recommend. If you're out of the fur-lined mousetrap now, if you've always wanted to bet on yourself, if you always had an idea, explore it. Reach out to John, reach out to me. We'll see what we can do to help.
Thank you for that advice, Colm. This concludes the GYFT Show for today.